Welcome everybody to Clinical Trials 101. We chose to hold this webinar today to celebrate Clinical Trials Day, which actually takes place tomorrow, May 20th, by raising clinical trial awareness and honoring clinical research professionals across the globe. So we want to remind you that during this seminar, all participants will be in a listen-only mode, and there will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation using questions submitted through the Q&A feature. Please remember that information provided in this web seminar is not intended as a substitute for your physician's guidance and care. We would like to thank Cogent, Genentech, Decipher, IDRx, and Novartis for their educational grants for our webinar series. My name is Sarah Rothschild, and I am the Executive Director of the LifeRaf Group, and I would like to introduce our presenter for today. Dr. Kelly is a medical oncologist at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center who has expertise in treating and researching bone and soft tissue sarcomas and Merkel cell carcinoma. She works very closely with a team of medical oncologists, surgeons, radiation oncologists, nurses, and patient support advocates. Dr. Kelly's research aims to develop new and more personalized therapies to treat sarcomas. She's actively involved in developing and designing clinical trials that will look at novel agents that target molecular changes within tumors. She's also studying innovative combination immunotherapy options that will harness a person's own immune defenses to fight their cancer. Dr. Kelly has a particular interest in advancing understanding of GIST and other sarcomas at the molecular level. She is using liquid biopsies to analyze tumor DNA in the blood and tumor biopsies to uncover a biomarker that will ultimately help match the best treatment option with each individual person's tumor. Dr. Kelly is committed to designing and developing novel therapeutic clinical trials for GIST patients that incorporate correlative studies which provide an opportunity to further our understanding of this disease. And so with that, I'd like to turn this over to Dr. Kelly, and thank you so much for presenting today.
Thank you, Sarah, and good afternoon to everybody. So I really just wanted to use this time to kind of provide an overview of clinical trials. So we're going to go through things in a stepwise fashion and look at how a patient's journey would, how a patient goes on a journey of a clinical trial. So what is a clinical trial? This is essentially a study that involves, this is a study that involves people and often are designed to find ways to improve the management and quality of life for patients with a certain disease. Oh, sorry about that. So cancer clinical trials, the goals and the objectives. So often a clinical trial represents the final step in a series of research studies that aim to improve the way we diagnose cancer, prevent cancer, treat cancer, assess response to cancer treatment, and manage symptoms of cancer and side effects from its treatments. There are several types of cancer clinical trials, and they can be simply divided into therapeutic clinical trials, where we're looking at a form of cancer treatment, and then non-therapeutic trials, where we're looking at other aspects related to cancer, such as translational trials, which are focused on trying to identify biomarkers or maybe a protein marker in a cancer that can be used to determine if a patient's tumor is more or less likely to respond to a treatment, for example. Qualitative research studies are focused on non-numerical data. What does that mean? So it means perhaps analyzing interviews or videos, audio recordings that are taken. And then quantitative research is focused on numerical data. So this would be whereby, for example, a questionnaire is provided to a patient and the data then is analyzed from that, so that it will be a quantitative form of research. And generally speaking, these are all types of clinical studies that can be used in cancer care. And all of them would go through a similar form of rigor in terms of protecting patients that are entering these studies. And we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. So in terms of traditional drug development, focusing on our therapeutic studies, for example, first of all, we look at for identifying a target, perhaps within the tumor. And then we find the agent that will then target this target. And then as the research continues, we enter into the clinical trial space where a drug is brought into the clinical arena. And this is in the form of a phase 1 study. So this is the first kind of phase of clinical development within patients or healthy volunteers. So a phase 1 study then may lead to a phase 2 and then to phase 3. And so the priority, let's say, of the phase 1 study is focused on safety and tolerability of the drug in question. So it's trying to find the right dose that we're going to use to treat this cancer and the right schedule. So that's the priority of the phase 1 aspect of the study. Some phase 1 studies, though, will be designed such that once we determine the appropriate dose and schedule for the drug in question, that then it may expand to look for a potential signal of efficacy within a certain disease setting. And with that, hand in hand, during that aspect, the dose expansion, for example, safety is still a priority. So we're trying to gain as much information on the safety of the compound being investigated. Then phase 2 is the next phase in clinical development of a drug. And here the trial is focused on both safety and efficacy. So we're looking for an efficacy signal to see if the compound in question is doing what it is intended to do. And then whether we're also expanding on the data that we generate from the phase 1, expanding on that to learn more about the safety of the compound. And then phase 3 is really, again, focused on efficacy. It's confirming the signal of efficacy that was seen previously in the previous phase 1-2 pathway. Safety data will still be generated and is very important in phase 3 studies also. But the ultimate primary goal of the phase 3 study is generally signal confirming and efficacy. So just a little bit of background about clinical trials, particularly cancer clinical trials. So where are trials performed? These are generally performed in authorized and appropriately certified institutions in the conduct of clinical trials. A principal investigator represents the lead researcher overseeing the conduct of a study. And the protocol, you may, if you're ever offered to participate in a clinical trial, you may hear your research team talk about the protocol. This essentially is a document that determines how a clinical trial should be conducted, which ensures the safety of the clinical trial participants and the integrity of the data collected. This must be followed strictly, and any deviations from the protocol are noted and recorded. So who oversees the conduct of a clinical trial? This is essentially broken down into the clinical research team and also the regulatory team. So the clinical research team, as I alluded to, the principal investigator is overseeing the conduct of the trial in a given institution. In the case of trials that are ongoing in many different sites throughout the country or indeed internationally, there will be an overarching lead principal investigator, but then each individual site will have a principal investigator of the study in that site. Then the research team also incorporates clinical research nurses who are trained in clinical research and are, well accustomed and aware of the clinical trial that they are working in. A clinical research coordinator is helping to coordinate all aspects of the clinical trial, ensuring that, for example, clinical trial participants, their appointments are scheduled appropriately, all the necessary investigations that they must have are ordered appropriately, and that any additional research tests are again performed and coordinated properly. And then there's a clinical trial pharmacist who is integral to a clinical trial as well. And then the regulatory team ensures that the clinical trial conduct at a site adheres to the clinical trial protocol and the IRB and FDA regulations. So who should be considered for a clinical trial? In my opinion, all cancer patients at every stage in their cancer journey should be considered for clinical trials if there and if there are clinical trials available for them. So this is a diagram that highlights the clinical trial journey for a patient. So it starts with a patient being offered an informed consent about a clinical trial. And I'll go into what this means, what this is. But essentially, it's informing patients about what the trial is, the goals of the trial, the details of the study, every aspect from the schedule that a patient would be asked to adhere to during a clinical trial, to the potential safety of the agent that's being investigated, and any potential benefits or risks associated that are known. So then once informed consent is obtained, then a patient will move into what's called the screening phase. And the screening phase really just is a phase where screening tests are performed, which are generally, basic laboratory work, also maybe basic cardiac imaging, an echocardiogram or an EKG, staging imaging like a CT or an MRI. And it may also involve some research testing in the form of blood samples that are collected, or indeed a research biopsy. And then these investigations are all then reviewed. The results of these are all reviewed by the investigator that's enrolling the patient on the trial. And we have to confirm that the patient is then fully eligible to go on the study based on the guideline and outline from the clinical trial protocol. It's important to note also, when a patient signs informed consent, that, a patient has the right to withdraw from a study at any point in time. So it's not something that's set in stone, but so I think it's important to know that a patient can change their mind at any point along the way. But if they do so, that it's really important to inform their research team about what they're thinking, and if they are thinking of coming off a trial, so that then the research team can make sure that things are done appropriately and that a patient's safe in what they're doing. So then once a patient is deemed fully eligible for a trial, they then will enter into the treatment phase of the study. And I'll go through this shortly. Then once the treatment phase has ended, there is an end of study visit generally, and then the patient enters the follow-up phase. So who can participate in a clinical trial? Well, this is outlined by the eligibility criteria that is listed in the clinical trial protocol. And it essentially, certain trials will be enrolling healthy volunteers or patient volunteers. And the clinical trial will also tell us what age group of patients are appropriate to enroll in a study. In terms of the eligibility criteria, these essentially are predefined criteria that describe who is eligible or indeed ineligible to participate in the study. And these do vary from trial to trial. And these criteria are created to ensure that a clinical trial investigation is performed in a similar group of patients and allow clear interpretation of the study results. And so it tries to reduce the possibility of confounding factors to account for the trial results. So talking a little bit more about the informed consent form. So this is a document that provides the potential trial participants with information outlining all aspects of the study and includes the following key components: the nature of the trial being offered, the potential benefits and risks associated with the trial, reasonable alternative treatment options for a patient. The consent form is written in language that can be understood by all potential participants, and this is really important. It also ascertains the understanding of participants and is essentially used to document informed consent. And the informed consent is revised and updated whenever important new information becomes available that may be relevant to participants that have consented. So clinical trial terms that you may hear of being used in the discussion about clinical trials that may be offered: the term placebo. So this is essentially any treatment that has no active properties. Essentially, it's like a sugar pill or a saline solution. And not every trial incorporates a placebo, but it is important to ask your doctor or research team that are discussing the trial with you whether the trial does incorporate a placebo or not. In terms of other terms that can be used, randomization is something that some clinical trials incorporate. This is a process of random assignment of patients by chance to groups that receive different treatments in a clinical trial. And again, this is really important to understanding a trial and whether this is the right thing for you to do, whether this is right for you at that point in time in your cancer journey. Open label versus blinded. Open label refers to when the patient and the study team know what treatment a participant is receiving in a clinical trial. Some studies are actually what we call blinded, so that this is in the case of randomized studies and refers to the patient and the study team being unaware as to which treatment arm a patient is assigned. And then other terms refer to single center versus multi-institution. So a single center trial is a trial that's just being conducted at one single center. Whereas a multi-institution trial, essentially the trial is being conducted at several centers in a given country or indeed internationally. So in multi-institution trials, particularly in early phase studies, there may be what we call spot availability. So it may be that their spots become available in a study at certain periods of time. These may be allocated in a certain order to individual institutions. So not every institution at a certain time may have access to that spot, and it's generally rotated. Screening phase. So the screening phase is entered upon providing informed consent to a participant in a clinical trial. And as I explained before, it consists of various test procedures that are necessary to confirm a participant's suitability or eligibility to enroll in a study. Then a patient, once deemed eligible, will move into the treatment phase. This essentially requires regular attendance to the clinical trial site of clinical evaluation and investigation. And the schedule is generally predetermined and is often incorporated in the informed consent form. There's a calendar of visits that is required. And if this isn't available in the consent form, this is definitely something that a patient should look for when entering into a study. So they know exactly how frequently they need to come to see the doctor and the research team as part of the trial. Essentially during the treatment phase, with every visit that you're coming for treatment, You will have basic, routine investigations conducted as part of that before one would receive treatment at each visit. And also your team will be reviewing you from a clinical perspective, listening to any symptoms that you have, but also any potential side effects to study therapy that have emerged. So it's really important to outline any changes that have happened, good or bad, in the preceding period of time since your last visit. And also it's really important, though, that if things are changing from visit to visit, that you contact your research team even before your visit happens, just to inform them of any changes, because some of these may be relevant and they may want to act on that information sooner than just the next visit. Follow-up phase. So follow-up occurs following completion of the active treatment phase of a study. And this may be in-person or remote assessments. And each trial will have a different follow-up phase. This may be very different from trial to trial. So how does one find a clinical trial? I think there are several resources out there to help identify clinical trials that may be relevant for patients. One that I commonly use is clinicaltrials.gov. This is a web-based resource, and it provides easy access to information on publicly and privately supported clinical interventional studies on a wide range of diseases and conditions. It actually looks at international studies and includes studies ongoing in 221 countries. The information is provided and updated by the sponsor or principal investigator of the clinical study and updated over time. It was created as a result of the FDA Modernization Act of 1997 and which required the US Department of Health and Human Services to establish a registry of trials conducted under IND applications to test the effectiveness of experimental drugs for serious or life-threatening diseases or conditions. So the NIH and FDA collaborated to develop this site, and it was open to the public in the year 2000. And the website is maintained by the US National Library of Medicine and the NIH. So this is an example of the home sheet of this website. And you can see that it helps you define the study, asking you to enter in the condition that you're interested in. For example, GIST, you would type that into that box. And then other terms would be included. Maybe if you know there's a certain drug that you are interested in, you want to know if there's a clinical trial that might be suitable in the disease, in the cancer that one has. And then you can enter in the country or not. And so then that will populate the list of trials that it has recorded in its registry, and that you can then review. And each trial then has various information about it: what phase, the types of drugs that are being looked at, the eligibility criteria that the trial incorporates, and also the sponsor of the study, and where the study, most importantly, where the study is being performed, what institutions is it available in. And then here's another list that I obtained from cancer.net website. This is another really good resource for patients about clinical trials. And this is an example of, I'm not going to go through these, but just to give you some insight that there are so many clinical trial, general listing sites that you can look at. And other really good resources on clinical trials include the National Cancer Institute and then cancer.net. And obviously for GIST, the support groups, the LifeArc group and others will also likely have information on their websites, maybe about potential trials that are ongoing as well. And the probably most important place to look for a trial is the institution where you're receiving your care, and your doctor that you see. They will be able to help you find potential trials that might be suitable for you. And it's really important to ask the question of them if there is a trial available for you. And then questions to ask when you're considering a trial. I've just outlined some here. The list is endless though, but some of them would include, what is the goal of the trial? So I really put this here in case you are in a position where you're offered a clinical trial, these might be some relevant questions to consider asking your doctor about the trial. So how long would I be in the trial? What tests and treatments are involved? Is there a placebo? What are the possible side effects or risks associated with the treatment under investigation? How will I know if the treatment is working? Will I need to pay out of pocket for any treatments or tests? Will my insurance cover some costs? Will the clinical trial cover some costs? This is a really important question, and I think it's one that we are asked often. And generally, the informed consent will include what aspects of the study are covered from the trial itself. And then otherwise, your insurance would be asked to pay for the visits, the administration of the treatment, etc. And generally, each institution where trials are ongoing will have a financial services department that you can then call and make sure you understand, the costs that are involved in a trial and whether they would be covered by your insurance. And you can also, I would strongly encourage that you will call your insurance company and clarify that as well. Will my other questions that you may be thinking would be, will my tissue and blood be collected and used in medical research? How will my privacy be protected? Will the study researchers work with my doctor while I'm in a clinical trial? And may I stop participating in the trial at any time? So when deciding to participate in a clinical trial, there are potential benefits, but there are indeed potential risks. Some of the benefits are that you will have access to a new treatment that is not available to people outside of the trial. And the research team will watch you closely. So while you have your regular care that you would generally receive, care team, you will also have an additional research team following you as well closely. If the treatment being studied is more effective than the standard treatment, you may be among the first to benefit from this. The trial may help scientists also learn about cancer and help people in the future. So the altruistic nature of joining a clinical trial. Potential risks. The new treatment, unfortunately, may not be better than the current standard of care. And in some cases, it may be worse. We obviously don't want that to be the case, but it's that may be a possibility of a new treatment under investigation. New treatments may have side effects, some of which may not all be known. It depends on the phase of the trial that one enters. An early phase study is focused on safety, and we may not know all the side effects of a drug. The later phase 2 and phase 3, we have more information about the safety going into those studies regarding the potential side effects of a treatment. You may be required to make more visits to the doctor than if you were receiving the standard of care treatment. You may have extra expenses related to extra visits, such as travel, housing, and childcare costs. Some of these may be covered from the trial, from the sponsor of the trial, and it's important to find that out at the outset of a study from the research team if any of these costs will be covered. You may need extra tests, and even if a new treatment has benefits, in some patients it may not work for you. And then, as I said, health insurance may not cover all patient care costs in a trial. So it's important to understand that going into the study when, through communication with the financial services department in the center where you're receiving the trial, but also your insurance company. So the importance of clinical trial participation is that really clinical trials help build the future of medicine. And today's clinical trials are tomorrow's standard of care. If you look at GIST, for example, all the agents that we have currently FDA approved were in a clinical trial at some point, and they were the new unknown treatment for patients that went into those studies. And so without those clinical trials, we would not have our standard of care treatments now. And clinical trials are the way that we look to improve upon the current treatments that we have for patients. So I just wanted to look at some GIST-specific clinical trials. This is not a comprehensive review. There are others, but I wanted to share some of the ones that are ongoing, so that you can understand. We can talk a little bit more about the phases of the trials that are ongoing at the minute. So firstly, we'll look at some phase 3 studies, looking at the second-line setting for GIST for patients who have progressed or have been intolerant of imatinib in the advanced setting of GIST. So first of all, we'll talk about ripretinib. So ripretinib is a broad spectrum switch control kinase KIT and PDGFR alpha inhibitor. And it was designed to target the primary and secondary resistant mutations that we can see present in KIT or PDGFR alpha, which are the common genomic features of GIST. So going back to the FDA approval of ripretinib in GIST, this is in the fourth line setting currently, and this was based off the data that was generated from the Invictus phase 3 study. So outlining it here, this was published in July 2020. So this study was a double blind, so neither patient nor the research investigators knew what treatment arms the patient were assigned to. It was randomized, so patients were assigned randomly to a treatment arm, and there was a placebo aspect to this study. And it was a phase 3 study, so a large study focused on trying to understand the efficacy of ripretinib in this setting, in essentially the fourth line setting. So majority of patients would have had prior imatinib, sunitinib, regorafenib, and then would have gone into this study. And fortunately, we saw a significant improvement for patients who received ripretinib, in that it helped delay growth of the disease. The median what we call progression-free survival was 6 months versus 1 month for the placebo. And on the basis of this study, ripretinib was approved for patients with advanced GIST. The INTRIGUE study was another phase 3 study looking at ripretinib, but in this case, the other treatment arm was sunitinib. So this essentially included patients really focused on the second line setting. So patients who had failed treatment on imatinib and then were enrolling on this study. And in this study, we saw no real significant difference in the originally published data published in 2022. We saw no significant difference in the progression-free survival between either treatment arms. So they had comparable outcomes in the data when it was looked at as a whole. But importantly, ripretinib was tolerated better than sunitinib. Now, the data from this study has been further analyzed, and patients who went on this study did have circulating tumor DNA collected, so in the form of a blood sample. And this sample was, we then looked at circulating tumor DNA within the blood, and that was then sequenced to understand the molecular nature of the tumor and how that may have changed over time on the treatment. But ultimately, this analysis that I'm showing you here essentially showed that ctDNA was detected in 280 of the patients that were enrolled in the study. Of note, 453 patients were actually randomized, and then ctDNA was only detected, though, in 280. So it's not always feasible that we will be able to detect ctDNA. But in the population where we were able to, they then were able to stratify the patients based on the molecular profile of the tumors. And so what was then done was the outcomes for patients on each of the treatment arms, ripretinib versus sunitinib, were looked at based on this molecular information. And you can see here, when they looked at the KIT exon 11 mutant GIST cohort for patients who had secondary resistant mutations in KIT exon 17 or 18, ripretinib performed significantly better than sunitinib in this setting. And on the contrary, then in the KIT exon 11 mutant cohort with secondary resistant mutations in KIT exon 13 and 14, we see sunitinib performed well there. So as a consequence of this data, the next study to be looked at will be called INSIGHT, and this is going to be a second-line setting study. So patients who have failed prior imatinib therapy will be eligible for this. And the study is going to be looking at ripretinib versus sunitinib again, and is going to be focused, though, on patients with advanced GIST who have a primary KIT exon 11 mutation and secondary resistant mutations in 17 or 18 and have failed prior imatinib therapy. This will be a phase 3 international randomized open label study that will be conducted, and patients, as part of pre-screening to see if they're potentially eligible for this study, will undergo ctDNA analysis to confirm whether or not they have whether or not their tumor has the genetic makeup that is that the trial is interested in. There's going to be 54 participants in the study. 36 will be enrolled into the ripretinib arm and 18 into the sunitinib arm. The dose will be 100 for ripretinib, 150 milligrams daily. For sunitinib, it will be 50 milligrams daily, delivered 4 weeks on and 2 weeks off. So a 6-week schedule. So the cycle, as I said, the duration is 6 weeks, and that will be then continued in a continuous fashion, depending on how a patient is tolerating this, and ultimately determined by how they're responding, which will be determined from radiological tests that will be performed every 6 weeks for the first 6 cycles, and then every 12 weeks. And the primary goal of this study is to compare the efficacy of ripretinib versus sunitinib as measured by progression-free survival based on independent radiologic review, and crossover is allowed. So two terms here that we haven't spoken about yet. One is, what is independent radiologic review? So studies may determine that most of the time a trial will be conducted and the radiologic review will be performed in the individual sites. And based on that interpretation, will be used to determine whether a patient is benefiting from the study, in that are they responding, seeing shrinkage or stabilization of disease, or unfortunately, are they progressing? Is the cancer growing despite being on the treatment? Some studies warrant that there is a central or independent radiologic review, so separate to the site where the study is being conducted, a separate group of trial radiologists will be reviewing the imaging as well. And the decision about whether a patient is benefiting from the treatment is determined by that central radiology review. So another term here, crossover, is essentially whereby if there are two treatment arms, one is the investigational agent versus the standard of care agent, as we have here. So Sunitinib is the standard second-line treatment currently for GIST. Ripretinib will be the investigational treatment. So here, crossover essentially means if somebody was assigned, ultimately found to have progression, that their cancer has grown on the treatment, and at that point they can be then unblinded to know whether they're receiving one treatment or another. In this case, it's an open label study, so we will know whether patients are receiving one treatment versus another. But then if they were, let's say they were assigned to Sunitinib, and at the at the point where it's deemed that that is no longer benefiting the patient, then the patient can cross over to receive the other treatment, Ripretinib. So the next agent that is currently under investigation in a phase 3 study in the second line setting is Cogent 9486. And this is an agent that is focused on targeting mutations in KIT in the activation loop. And there was a phase 1 study looking at this agent already. At that time, it was called Plex 9486. And it was looked at alone and in combination with Sunitinib. So where it was looked at in a monotherapy on its own, this study was really focused on determining the dose that the safe dose to use. And once that was determined, then there was an expansion whereby patients were then allowed to receive it in combination with Sunitinib. Again, there was a period where they were determining the safety of the combination. And once that was determined, then the efficacy was further evaluated. So in this phase 1 study, the results of this were published, and focusing on this figure here in the bottom right-hand corner, we can see the progression-free survival for each of the treatments that were looked at. So Plex 9486 on its own at a dose of less than or equal to 500 milligrams versus Plex 9486 at 1,000 milligrams, which is the recommended phase 2 dose that was determined, versus the combination of 9486 in combination with Sunitinib. And what we saw here was that there was a median progression-free survival of 12 months for the combination, which was very impressive. And on the basis of that, now we have a study called the PEAK study ongoing, which is looking at the combination of Cogent 9486 and Sunitinib. And there are several parts to this study. So part 1 is where they're looking at Cogent 9486 and Sunitinib in patients who have had more than one, have had one or more prior lines of therapy. And then the next cohort in part 1 is looking at patients whereby they have had 2 or more prior lines of therapy. And here patients will be assigned to receive a 2-week lead-in of either Cogent 9486 on its own or Sunitinib on its own before receiving the combination. And then part 2 is essentially a randomized controlled trial of Cogent 9486 and Sunitinib, the combination, versus Sunitinib alone. Patients may only have had prior treatment with imatinib, and this is in the advanced GIST setting. And it's going to enroll 388 patients. Patients will be randomized in a 1-to-1 fashion to either treatment arm, and crossover will be allowed. So then looking at more studies in the advanced GIST setting and focusing on phase 1 studies. One is looking at the agent NB003. This is a drug that is a designed to cover the spectrum of primary and secondary KIT mutations in GIST. This study is ongoing. It's a multi-center study ongoing in Asia and also here in the US at Memorial Sloan Kettering. NB003 is an oral drug, and patients with advanced GIST who have progressed on or are intolerable to imatinib and other standard of care agents or refused other standard of care agents with advanced GIST or other malignancies that harbor KIT or PDGFR alpha mutations are eligible. The first phase of the study that is currently ongoing is a dose escalation where we're trying to determine, again, the right dose and safety of the drug, and then further expansions are planned once the appropriate dose has been identified. The next agent currently under investigation in early phase in GIST that I've highlighted is Theseus compound THE-630, and this is an oral next generation pan-KIT inhibitor, again focused on targeting the broad spectrum of KIT mutations that we can find in patients with advanced GIST. This is a phase 1/2 trial, and it's a multi-center study. And so the first phase 1 will be focused on determining the safety and appropriate dose. And then the phase 2 will then be signal finding. So the phase 2 is looking at various cohorts. So cohort 1 is focused on patients that have advanced GIST who are looking for treatment in the 5th line setting. So they've had 4 prior treatments and are looking at treatment in the 5th line. In cohort 3, it's focused on patients who are looking for a treatment in the 3rd or 4th line setting. And then cohort 3 is focused on treatment in the 2nd line setting. And for the phase 1, the dose escalation, patients must have been intolerant or progressed on imatinib and 1 other tyrosine kinase inhibitor. And then IDRX-42 is a KIT inhibitor. And again, the study that is ongoing for evaluating this agent is a phase 1/phase 1b study. The dose escalation will look at trying to ascertain the appropriate dose for patients that is safe. Patients are eligible if they have failed at least imatinib. The dose confirmation aspect of this study will evaluate dosing that is deemed to be safe in the from the dose escalation phase, and patients are suitable if they have failed at least imatinib therapy. And then further dose expansions are planned in various treatment lines, 2nd, 4th, and 5th line and beyond. And of note, patients are excluded if they have received prior Theseus 630, Nube, or the Cogent 9486 and Sunitinib treatment. And I'm going to finish there, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have regarding what I've spoken about.
Thank you, Dr. Kelly. This is a great presentation, very well balanced about just an introduction and also what options there are for patients. So we do have some questions that came in. This is regarding liquid biopsy. So patient is actually a D842V patient, but was deemed not to really need the targeted therapy that's been approved already, Ripretinib. But the question is liquid biopsy being used to determine if treatment should be started on Ripretinib in either a clinical trial setting or in practice?
That's a really good question. So currently ctDNA is not being used to determine whether a patient requires treatment. It really is still an investigational research tool. I think with time that may change, but to determine whether one may benefit from treatment or requires treatment, we still are relying on radiographic imaging and understanding the molecular makeup of the tumor that we've analyzed as well. In certain cases, though, let's say, you know, I've had scenarios where patients have had, let's say, a biopsy of their primary tumor, and it's been a really small sample. And when we do the standard tissue sequencing, that unfortunately the tissue is insufficient, and we haven't been able to generate the information we need regarding the molecular information of the tumor from that. In that case, where you may then consider ctDNA at that time, and if ctDNA does yield a molecular, it does generate molecular information. For example, if somebody is found to have a KIT mutation, etc., then, you know, that information often can be used to kind of inform treatment decisions in that setting. But for PGRF D842V, it depends on the clinical setting that is being looked at. And if it's somebody who has had no evidence of disease on a scan, we're not using, let's say, ctDNA to inform treatment decisions in conjunction with that.
Yeah.
I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you. Another question came in about, has Ripretinib been studied in advanced sdh-deficient GIST patients?
That's a good question. I don't believe that. I don't believe that I'm not aware of Ripretinib being looked at in sdh-deficient GIST. I'm not sure if the original phase 1 study that was performed, which was quite an extensive study, may have incorporated some patients.
They did have some, but it wasn't a lot.
Yeah, so we may not be able to really truly infer from that if it was a small number of patients.
So what happens, like, for instance, Memorial Sloan did their own investigator-sponsored study. I think it was the MEK inhibitor plus imatinib. And if it shows activity, what happens with those type of studies in terms of consideration of approval for when it's not in an industry-sponsored study in terms of approval for the disease?
Sorry, Sarah, can you repeat the question?
So if a institution sponsors their study and they show activity of a therapeutic agent that's off label, but it shows some activity in the disease, how is that used to use evidence to help create an indication for the disease on label?
Yeah, so that's a really important question too. So although, let's say, that study was what we call an investigator-initiated trial, which means that it was Ping Chi who designed that study based on her scientific work that she generated that showed that combination looked to have really good preclinical activity. And then obviously led to the phase 1, phase 2 study, whereby also really good clinical activity was seen in patients in the frontline setting. So in that case, you know, the clinical investigators are working with industry partners. You know, if we see a really good signal, we work then with the industry partners to see if they, you know, would consider a larger study in looking at that combination. So that's generally the process that takes place.
And sometimes I guess maybe a company might not want to pursue that further, even if there's a signal from that study.
Yeah, exactly. It just depends on the landscape, you know, of trials that are ongoing, and also the priorities that the company has. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess that's where advocacy groups can really come in.
Exactly.
If a patient is successful at completion, if the patient is successful at completion of a trial, are they permitted to continue with that therapy?
Yeah. So generally speaking, studies will, unless they have a pre-specified within the clinical trial protocol that they say treatment is for 6 months or treatment is for 12 months, whatever that may be. A lot of the time it's that treatment is continuous, particularly for GIST. It's that treatment is continuous as long as a patient is tolerating treatment and deemed to be benefiting from treatment. And let's say, and which is the hope, that somebody does really, really well and continues on treatment for a very extended period of time. Then it may come that, let's say, the trial is finished and well finished, the analysis has been done, and they ultimately want to close the study. And generally speaking, the sponsor of the study does everything in their power to ensure that the patient has access to drug. So if the study actually closes, then the patient will ideally transition to treatment off trial, either in an expanded access form or otherwise, to allow them to continue treatment. So in my experience, that's generally what happens. Unfortunately, there are scenarios, though they're uncommon, where maybe a study closes abruptly for whatever reason may be, and then unfortunately patients may no longer have access to the drug, but that's really uncommon. We do not see that happen very often.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen that with the GIST trials.
Exactly, yeah, thankfully.
If a patient is looking at a study and a site location for that trial is closed, but they enter one that's further away, are they able to join the trial from further away and then switch to the location closest to them?
That's a really good question. And this is dictated by the sponsor of the study. So if it's an industry-led study, for example, the PEAK study or the INSIGHT study, for example, ultimately the sponsor will decide whether that is okay or not. Okay. Sometimes they're flexible, sometimes they're not. But you know what you can generally do there is that, let's say you're based in an institution, maybe they don't have the trial or they're going to open the trial, and then you know that it's somewhere else. Your institution's team can generally reach out to the trial, the clinical trial team, the sponsor of the study, and ask that question in advance, and generally they will be able to tell you whether that's feasible or not. I've definitely had patients of mine do that.
Yeah, we've been approached that question quite a bit as well. And if like, for instance, ctDNA is part of the process or the protocol with the study, but it's not shared with the patient, does the patient have a right to get access to that information, or is that dictated by?
It's generally determined by the study. And so, you know, often the informed consent may be able to tell you that if you look at, let's say, the Invictus study where they did look at ctDNA, I don't believe that data was available for patients, and it was analyzed at a later time point. So that is, it's not that people don't want to share the information, it's just often that the analysis doesn't happen until it's not maybe being analyzed in real time. In terms of INSIGHT, given that the new study that is being planned, given that the eligibility for the study is determined by the molecular makeup of the tumor, and you need to be pre-screened to be determined if you're going to be eligible. That information will be available then. But in general, in studies that have been done so far where they've just been collected, ctDNA is being collected in more of an investigational or exploratory manner, the results have not been available generally in real time.
Okay. We're actually at the end of the hour. I know that there are a few questions that weren't answered, so maybe we'll follow up with them, just make sure that they get their answers to those questions. But I just want to conclude this web seminar and thank Dr. Kelly for her time and presentation today. It's been wonderful to work with you over the years, and we really hope to continue to provide these educational seminars to the community so they feel really informed about what treatment options there are in their GIST journey, and just to know that if anybody has any follow-up questions along the way, they can reach out to our team and we can do the best we can to answer them. So I hope everybody enjoys the rest of your Friday and have a really wonderful weekend, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah, and the Life Group.